In the year of 1970, on the 24th day of May, the Soviet Union embarked on a venture that would later be christened as the Kola Super-deep Borehole. A relic of the past, the hole, now abandoned, still exists today, a gaping maw that plunges into the earth for about 40,000 feet. The borehole is a testament to Russia's audacity, a symbol of the times they dared to dig deeper than they should have. Across the desolate Russian wilderness, several such holes remain, unprotected, a grim reminder of the past. The gravest mistake I ever made was descending into one of these holes, a decision that would forever alter the course of my life. A year ago, my profession as a geologist led me to a quaint Russian fishing village, nestled in the heart of Siberia. The village was a humble settlement, home to no more than 200 souls, most of whom were fishermen or hunters. The village was a world unto itself, a microcosm of life that existed in stark contrast to the bustling cities I was accustomed to. The villagers lived simple lives, their days dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the ebb and flow of the sea. My work had often landed me in peculiar situations, but this was a different beast altogether. My grasp of the Russian language was tenuous at best, and with only 2 people in the village who spoke English besides my crew, communication was a challenge. But with a shared bottle of vodka and a good spirit, we found common ground. The villagers were some of the warmest people I had ever met. They welcomed us into their homes, shared their meals with us, and treated us like family. Despite the language barrier, we formed bonds that transcended words. Among them, I found a particular friend in the village's sole police officer, Fahim. Fahim was a man of simple pleasures, his duties mostly involving escorting the overly inebriated villagers home. More often than not, he would join in the merriment, rather than put an end to it. We quickly formed a bond, finding joy in the oddities of a world cut off from civilization. This tranquility, however, was shattered in the 9th month of our stay. A local girl, 7-year-old Daria, had vanished. She was last seen playing with her friends near an old, abandoned building, a relic from the Soviet era believed to be a silo. The structure had been sealed and forgotten for nearly 4 decades, yet it held a certain allure for the children. The silo, with its towering structure and mysterious past, was a source of endless fascination for the children. They would often dare each other to get close to it, spinning tales of monsters and treasures hidden within. On the day of Daria's disappearance, the silo was found to be open, its doors broken down to reveal a room filled with antiquated equipment and a gaping hole in the center. The hole was about 50 feet in diameter, its depth unknown. In the center was a basic elevator platform, like something used for mining operations. All that could be seen was an endless abyss of darkness. Daria had fallen into it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. A fall that deep, even if the bottom was a pool of water, would be lethal. The other children insisted they heard Daria cry for help after falling into the hole, a claim that offered a glimmer of false hope to her terrified mother. For the first time, I saw Fahim spring into action, organizing a rescue operation and calling for official aid. I volunteered to help, drawing upon my experience in search and rescue operations back home in the United States. Alongside me was one of my colleagues, Stanley, a seasoned geologist with a heart as big as his frame. As we prepared for the descent, the mechanics worked to revive the ancient machinery, including the elevator. We attached a sinker to a line, hoping to measure the depth of the hole. Even our longest ropes, combined to almost 1,000 feet, weren't enough to reach the bottom. After a few hours, the mechanics announced that the elevator was operational. They had found some sort of protective suits, which, according to the few documents found in the facility, were necessary due to the high atmospheric pressure and temperature, which could reach up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. I knew then that we were embarking on a grim mission to retrieve the lifeless body of a little girl, a heartbreaking task that would at least allow her family to lay her to rest. Donning the ill-fitting suits, we stepped into the elevator, a rusty cage riddled with holes. We were armed with a single walkie-talkie to maintain contact with the surface and a few old flashlights. As the elevator descended, the numbers on a small screen indicating our depth, we were swallowed by an all-encompassing darkness. Fahim, ever the joker, tried to lighten the mood, comparing the darkness to the village's winter. Stanley and I managed weak chuckles in response. As we descended further, the atmosphere changed. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the chatter from the surface, once clear, was now nothing more than static. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the ancient elevator and Stanley's nervous shifting. Fahim seemed worried, a stark contrast to his usual jovial demeanor. His jokes had ceased, replaced by a furrowed brow and a look of deep concern. Suddenly, a soft voice echoed from the depths, a plea for help. It was faint, but unmistakable. Fahim and I exchanged glances. The voice was in English, a language Daria wouldn't have known. We called out, but there was no response. The descent continued, the elevator moving at a snail's pace. The heat was intensifying, and my head throbbed with a relentless ache. Hours passed, and we still hadn't reached the bottom. Suddenly, Fahim claimed to see a light at the bottom. Stanley and I saw nothing. I wondered if the heat and the darkness were playing tricks on Fahim's mind. As we descended further, the elevator jolted to a stop, throwing us to the floor. When I regained consciousness, Stanley was unconscious beside me, and Fahim was nowhere to be found. We tried to call for help, but the walkie-talkie only returned static. The elevator resumed its descent, and we were helpless to stop it. Hours turned into days, and the heat grew unbearable. Stanley and I were on the brink of consciousness, dehydrated despite our ample water supply. Then I heard it, a beautiful singing voice, echoing from the depths. It was in Russian, a language I didn't understand, but the melody was serene, pure. A light appeared from below, growing brighter as it ascended. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but darkness. I woke up a week later in a hospital. I had been found in the middle of a forest in eastern Russia by a pair of hunters. My story didn't add up, and there were no records of the hole or the village I had stayed in. My colleagues' numbers were disconnected or belonged to strangers. I was allowed to return to the United States on an emergency travel document, but when I arrived home, I found that my house was owned by someone else. It had been for at least 10 years. I spent months trying to make sense of what had happened. The world I returned to was not the one I remembered. Even world history and geography were different. The village I had spent nearly a year in was not on any map, and the hole, the very hole that had swallowed Daria and changed my life, did not exist according to public records. The people I had worked with, the friends I had made, were now strangers, their numbers disconnected or belonging to other people. I was a man out of place, a stranger in a world that was both familiar and alien. I found myself wandering the streets of my hometown, looking at the buildings and the people with a sense of detachment. My house, the place I had called home for years, was now owned by someone else. I stood outside, looking at the familiar structure, feeling a sense of loss that was both profound and unsettling. The ordeal had taken a toll on my mind. There were gaps in my memory, moments of time that were lost to me. I would find myself standing in a room with no recollection of how I got there or what I was doing. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echoes of Daria's cries for help still ringing in my ears. I tried to reach out to my colleagues, to the people I had worked with in the village, but their numbers were now disconnected, or they belonged to completely unrelated people. I was alone, a stranger in a world that was not my own. After a lengthy investigation, I was allowed to travel back to the United States on an emergency travel document. My fingerprints matched some documentation of my existence, which allowed me to prove my identity. But when I returned home, I discovered that my home was owned by somebody else. It had been for at least 10 years. It took me a long time to figure out what had happened. I spent days poring over maps, trying to find the village I had lived in. I read books on history, trying to reconcile the world I remembered with the world I was now in. But some changes were too big to be a horrible coincidence. Putting aside the personal changes that I've experienced here, even world history doesn't match what I remember studying. Geography is so vastly different. There's an entire continent missing from the map. Denial is a powerful tool. It took me months to come to terms with the very simple yet complicated fact. This is not the world that I belong to. I am a man out of time, a stranger in a world that is both familiar and alien. I walk the streets of my hometown, looking at the buildings and the people with a sense of detachment. I am a ghost, a specter of a man who once was, trapped in a world that is not my own. And as I wander, I can't help but wonder, what happened to Daria? What happened to Fahim and Stanley? Are they too lost in this strange new world? Or are they trapped in the darkness of the hole, forever lost to the world they once knew?